Greetings and welcome to this edition of
Positronic.
I'm Barry P. Cook. I'm here to talk to you about the most recent episode of Star Trek Strange New Worlds. It was called The Elysian Kingdom, and of course Elysian means heavenly or paradise-like. As the episode opens, we find Dr. Mbenga researching his daughter's condition when she asks him to please read her the end of the story that he's been reading to her all this time. And when she says she doesn't like a particular part of the story, he tells her that, you know, when she grows up, she can become an author if she wants and write her own stories before putting her back in the buffer. He then goes right to work on something, presumably to do with trying to find a cure, and ends up blasting himself in the face with some kind of powder or dust. He is then ordered by number one to get some rest when she comes in to find out why he hasn't cleared a landing party for duty yet, and finds that he is a bit out of sorts. On the bridge, having completed a survey of the nebula they were parked in, the captain orders the ship to depart and head to a starbase, but the ship is unable to move, either at warp or at impulse. And when its inability to move causes it to buck a little bit, and Ortegas falls off her chair to the floor and is wounded, the captain calls for the doctor. But when the doctor arrives on the bridge, he finds himself in the middle of some type of medieval story in which he is the king. He then consults the computer, which in the narrative of the story is an oracle, and finds that all systems are normal. So he heads to sickbay, which has been turned into some kind of sanctuary in the middle of an enchanted forest that the corridors have been turned into, to get his tricorder, where he runs into Nurse Chapel, who is the proprietor of said sanctuary and a healer of some type. He has a brief conversation with her as he's still trying to figure out what's going on, and La'an soon arrives in the form of a monarch from what would seem to be a neighboring kingdom, telling them that her kingdom has been taken over by an evil queen and asking him to utilize the power of some type of mystical stone, I guess called the Mercury Stone, to repel the queen. Said evil queen has sent her Crimson Guard to capture Hammer, who in this narrative is a wizard, and interestingly, he is also aware that he and the doctor are in the middle of a narrative. When the captain and Ortegas escort the king through the forest corridors to attempt a diplomatic solution to the capture of the engineer, they run into SPOK, who in this narrative is also a wizard and the brother of the engineer's wizard character. He agrees to help them go around the swamp, quote unquote, that they need to go around in order to get where they're going, and he leads them up a Jeffries tube to accomplish this, calling it a tunnel. Upon reaching the evil queen's throne room in the cargo bay, they find that UHURA is the queen. She asks the king for the Mercury Stone, and he says it could be anywhere, so she says that he and the captain and Ortegas will be tortured until they reveal its location. Of course, he doesn't know what the Mercury Stone is outside of what it is in the story. He doesn't know what in the real world is actually this Mercury Stone, so he has no idea what it is or where it is. In the dungeon, aka the brig, which has been fitted with actual bars, the doctor consults Hammer, who explains that before everything changed, he felt a consciousness press up against his own, but was able to resist it because of his telepathic training, which he also credits with allowing him to retain his memories of reality. Hammer cuts through the bars with an engineering tool, and everyone escapes, intent upon going to engineering to scan the entity, or scan for the entity, that Hammer spoke of, which it would seem is responsible for the craziness, and which Hammer suspects is part of the nebula. When they encounter Spock and the Queen's Crimson Guard blocking their path, Ortegas engages them in a sword fight, and when she's about to lose because she's outnumbered, number one shows up in the character of a huntress and chases the bad guys off with some well-placed arrows. After doing some scanning upon arriving in engineering, Hammer theorizes that they are at the mercy of a disembodied consciousness on the order of something called a Boltzmann brain, which is an actual scientific thing, which exists in the nebula, and which has created a scenario for the crew out of the story that the doctor's been reading to his daughter, and which it would seem based some of the changes to the narrative that have apparently been made after taking the story not from the doctor's mind, but the daughter's mind. We interrupt this episode review for a science moment.
So, the Boltzmann brain. What is that? It's a thought experiment, and it suggests
that it might be more likely for a single brain to spontaneously form in a void, complete with the memory of having existed in our universe, rather than for the entire universe to come about in the manner cosmologists think it actually did. Physicists use the Boltzmann brain thought experiment as a reductio ad absurdum argument for evaluating scientific theories.
Side note, at this point, it would seem that the daughter fancies the two characters that number one and Ortegas are playing, who in the actual story never meet, to be occasional romantic partners. When the Doctor tries to find his daughter in the buffer, it would appear that she's not there, about which he expresses quite a bit of dismay to Hemmer. Overhearing this conversation, Spock's character theorizes that the daughter is actually the Mercury Stone, and when he informs the Queen of this, she decides to capture her, which it seems she intends to do with the help of the character that the captain is playing, who, by the way, is a sniveling coward, which is hilarious. The Doctor concludes that if his daughter is in fact out of the buffer, she probably has gone to his quarters because she's always wanted to see them. And as he tries to make his way there, he encounters the captain, who in short order puts a knife to his throat before the Queen approaches demanding the girl. The Doctor, of course, refuses, and after telling them to stand down or he'll send them to somewhere called the Event Horizon, and they refuse to comply, Hemmer uses a rigged communicator to engage the transporter to send them to Cargo Bay 12, whilst hemming it up quite a bit, and it was glorious. The Doctor enters his quarters to find his daughter, whom it would seem has been cured by an invisible friend. When the Doctor asks to speak to the entity, the daughter says that he can't, but Hemmer theorizes that if he allows the entity to use him as a conduit, they would be able to communicate. So he does exactly that, and the entity explains that when she probed the ship, she discovered that the daughter was lonely, like her, and so she created the fantasy to give her some semblance of a childhood. When the Doctor demands that she release the ship, she says that she can't without the daughter's sickness returning. And when he can't choose between his daughter and the ship, the entity says that she can separate the daughter from her body so that her consciousness can join with her own, and that she will then live forever. When the daughter asks if her father can go with her, he explains that as the king had to let the Mercury Stone go, even though he didn't want to, when he realized that it had a soul and would die if he held on to it, which he did despite knowing he wouldn't be able to be happy without it, and further explains that she is his Mercury Stone, and offers her the choice to stay on the ship and exist in the buffer, which we know would be until either she dies or a cure is found, the latter of which has apparently been growing increasingly unlikely. She chooses to go with the entity. The entity then converts her to pure consciousness before his eyes. A moment later, his daughter materializes in front of him again, this time as an adult, having spent years in the intervening moment, creating and living out her own adventures with the entity, which she has named Deborah after her mother. She explains that she's safe and happy, and that he did the right thing, and that they may see each other again someday, but that he needs to live his life and be happy until then, which he promises to do, at which point everything returns to normal. It turns out that the only one who remembers the whole incident, as even Hemmer doesn't recall it, is the Doctor. To the rest of the crew, it's just been 5 lost hours. When number one seems to realize that the Doctor knows what happened to those 5 hours, which he acknowledges, she says it sounds like a hell of a story, and he begins to tell her what happened, saying that it's a story that begins like all stories, once upon a time. This episode was fantastic, excellent, perfect, amazing, glorious. There aren't enough adjectives for me to say how much I enjoyed this episode. The writing was extraordinary because they pulled the story from their minds, their butts. This is not a story like Macbeth, where they put the cast in Macbeth. It's a Macbeth-esque story or whatever, a Hamlet-esque story, but it's completely made up. It's an original story that they wrote apparently for this episode. It's the story of the book that we've been seeing over the last 8 episodes, and they did a great job of that. The, human condition story that is told through that story about the Doctor and his daughter was, to say it was great, it just is massively understating how excellent I think this story was. I can't say that we haven't seen a very similar story in other sci-fi or in Star Trek itself for that matter, but if we did, okay, great. This is just another one like it. And it was just words fail me. I enjoyed the hell out of it just because it had so much heart, because it was so science fiction-y, and because the cast was sublime in this episode, playing these other characters. Their acting chops cannot be denied. You know, I'm no best actor winner by any means, but I've done some acting. I've studied acting. I'm a fan of acting as a craft, and nothing, you know, in entertainment thrills me more than fantastic acting. Well, maybe a good redemption story, but fantastic acting is right up there with that. And to say that everybody in this episode did a fantastic job of playing their characters just doesn't do their performance justice. Some of the characters had more for the actors to work with than others. For example, the actress that plays Nurse Chapel is very good in her part, but she has like 4 lines, but she did them very well. Spock is barely in it, Ethan Peck's character, but he did a good job with what they gave him. But the actress that plays Ortegas, the actress that plays La'an, and Anson Mount were unbelievable in this episode. Just amazing. I was thrilled every second that this episode was on the screen. Every frame, to me, was magnificent. The set decoration, the art directing, the gentleman that plays Dr. Mbenga was also fantastic. He, of course, was playing the same character, but he really got to shine in this episode as the doctor. He was incredible. The young lady that plays the daughter did an excellent job. Rebecca Romaine wasn't really in it. She had a few lines and a little bit to do, and she did a good job as well with it. But this episode was sublime. That's all there is to it. I hope that they revisit this scenario in some way in a future episode. I don't know how they could do it since it occurred in this one location as a result of the entity inhabiting the nebula, but wow, would I love to see them all play these characters again sometime. It was just thrilling. This episode is an 11 out of 10. That's all there is to it. Fantastic. Star Trek at its finest. I'm just beside myself with glee over this episode. So there's nothing more I can say. I'm giddy, as you can see. It was just amazing. So I'm looking forward to the next 2 episodes that will end the season. I'll be back with my review of episode 9 once it's released. Until then, I'm out of here, and I wish you peace and long life.